can we, do you want to do the status report on the pedestrian bridge now? Or?
No.
Yes, okay, let's go to...
We've got all these folks that are here for this. Let's get back to the EIR.
Right, okay. Item 8A on the City Council agenda. Resolution to the City Council of the City of Emeryville certifying the final impact report for the Marketplace redevelopment project and making findings required by California Environmental Quality Act. Charlie, Brian.
Senior Planner Miru Desai again will make the staff presentation.
Good evening, Mayor Bukowski and council members. The City Council is requested to certify the final EIR for the Marketplace redevelopment project as recommended by the Planning Commission. In certifying the final EIR, the Council must make the following findings: that the final EIR has been completed in compliance with the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA, and that the final EIR reflects the city's independent judgment and analysis. The EIR was prepared by our city's consultant, LSA, and I will hand over to LSA to give a presentation over the overall process of the environmental review that took place for this project. And before she does that, I'd like to state what certification of a final EIR means. Certification of the final EIR does not in any way constitute approval of the proposed project or any alternative contained in the analysis. It does not signify city's preference for any particular mitigation measure, development plan, or design for the site. Certification means only that the City Council believed that the final EIR contains complete and appropriate analysis of identified environmental impacts, alternatives, and mitigation measures upon which to base future policy and development decisions with regard to the Marketplace project area, and that the FEIR, or the final EIR, reflects the independent judgment and analysis. Before I give it over to Lynette here, I'd like to point this out. You should find this on the dais. It's an errata sheet. It basically corrects a couple of typos on the mitigation measures which would apply to the said language in draft EIR, as well as to responses to comments. With that,
Maria, before you leave, I have a question of clarification. Mm-hmm. Does approval of this in EIR in any way impact the potential development of any other site in the city?
No, it does not.
Okay, so any concerns that any other developers may have that moving forward with this document does not in any way impair any consideration that might be given on any other development site?
That is correct.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
Well, since you raised that question, I'm not sure that makes total sense, because look, the concern that's being raised, that was raised earlier here, is that the Big Four traffic study was done primarily looking at those four projects and what they would do to traffic, which is a huge concern of the people that live here. And in the meantime, as this has gone forward, this project has virtually doubled in size. Well, that has an impact on the other developers, because if all the traffic or a greater percentage of the traffic that's being considered as something that we can work into these four developments, and one project takes more of the traffic pie, that's going to have an impact and a fallout to the other people. So to say that it doesn't impact their developments doesn't seem
well,
right.
It is reasonable, because this is only a study of environmental impacts. This is not a consideration of a project approval. Now, if we were considering a project approval of the maximum build-out, then yes, it would impact other potential projects. But because this is only an analysis of the environmental impacts, it does not in any way impair any other project from moving forward. And with any consideration, just because you approve 1.2 million square feet here doesn't mean you have to approve a project for 1.2 million. You could approve one for 500,000, and then whatever capacity might be left, so to speak, would be allowed with other projects. So that's why I asked that specific question.
And the other thing I would say is that the EIR looks at the traffic impacts
Of all the other projects at the same time. So
this EIR looks at the traffic impacts.
So that's why I raised that question. Okay.
I think I can clarify some of those issues in my presentation as well.
Okay, go right ahead. Please move forward.
Can we get the PowerPoint on? There we go. Great, thank you. Good evening, Mayor and members of the City Council. I'm going to try to make my presentation on the EIR that's before you this evening relatively brief, but if there's areas where you would like me to go into more detail, I will be happy to, so just let me know. But it is a very voluminous document. Before you, you should have the draft EIR, which is the big thick one, and then also the response to comments document, which is the thinner of the two. So tonight, the purpose of the meeting is to review the final EIR, which includes both the draft EIR and the responses to comments document. Those documents together constitute the final EIR. Consider the adequacy of that document. Does it provide an adequate evaluation of the proposed project and the alternatives that are described in the draft EIR? It's not to grant an approval on the project. It's simply to say that there's an adequate environmental analysis for you all to make an informed decision about approval of the project when you get to that point. And then finally is if you do determine that it's adequate, analysis provides adequate information based on the requirements of CEQA, then consider certification of the EIR. A decision-making body cannot consider approval of a project such as the Marketplace project, whether it's the project that's described as the proposed project in the draft EIR or one of the alternatives, until following a certification of an EIR. So this is the first step you have to take to then consider approval of a project, which then could impact other projects and what infrastructure is available to those projects. So I'm going to go over the CEQA process, just give you a quick overview beginning to end, talk briefly about the projects and alternatives that were considered in the EIR, and then the final EIR findings, and then our recommendation. So the CEQA process began on this project back in December of 2005 when a notice of preparation was issued and notifying agencies and interested individuals that the city would be preparing an EIR. On that, a scoping session was held before the Planning Commission. The draft EIR was then published in June of 2007. It was available for public review for 45 days, and then we received comments on it, prepared. CEQA requires that all the comments that you receive on a draft EIR that relate to the environmental issues and not the project merits, that you provide written responses to each of those comments. That's what's in this smaller volume that's before you this evening. So we provide written responses to each of the comments. And then finally, we're to the point where you're considering the EIR. The Planning Commission considered the adequacy of the EIR back in December, as Miru mentioned earlier this evening, and unanimously recommended certification of the document. And then once you complete that step, you can move on to considering the project. Did you
now
have
I
a
have
question?
a process question for you. I was told that that while the comment period was open, the only project that was being considered was the smaller project, and that after the close of the comment period, the alternative was developed with a more intense use. So there are some folks that feel that they didn't have a chance to comment on the consideration of the larger project because the comment period was closed. So can you address that?
Yes, I can. That happened, that is correct, that after based on the comments received on the draft EIR, both staff and the project applicant worked together to develop an alternative that responded to some of the comments that were received. We did an analysis of that alternative after the public review period closed and determined, and that analysis is included, I believe, in Chapter 3, to refresh my memory here. I'm sorry, Chapter 5 of the Response to Comments document, and we went through, and under CEQA, you have to, when a project changes, which often projects do change, and oftentimes we hope they change for the better as the process evolves. I mean, one of the purposes of CEQA is to get public input into a project and inform the project. That process happened. We evaluated that project to make sure, to determine, not to make sure, but to determine whether or not that the implementation of that alternative would result in any impacts beyond what was identified and analyzed in the draft EIR, and we considered it relative to the proposed project that was evaluated in the draft EIR, as well as the Main Street alternative, and essentially found that the impacts that would result from the reduced Main Street alternative, which was the alternative that was introduced, would be somewhere in the middle of what were identified for the proposed project and for the Main Street alternative, and made a final determination that the impacts were adequately disclosed in the draft EIR and no new impacts or mitigation measures would be required that weren't previously presented. So it's somewhat of a complicated process. It is all explained in here. The response to comments document was actually circulated and made available at the end of November. So that has been out now for approximately 45 days.
Mayor
Okay,
Bukowski?
go ahead.
I'd just like to elaborate a little bit on something that Ms. Dias has said, just to make it real clear. The Main Street alternative, of which the new project that you're referring to is a reduced version, was included in the draft EIR. It was available for public review and comment during the draft EIR comment period, and it was analyzed in the draft EIR at a level of detail that would have allowed it to become the project that could be approved. So the project that's now being considered, the so-called reduced Main Street alternative, is a smaller version of something that was in the draft EIR and was available for public review and comment during that time.
But but Charlie, isn't it, we had another project was the main one that everybody thought was going to happen. So people didn't bother to comment on this increased project, and then all of a sudden when we bring the little, this more dense project from the back burner to the front burner, then the folks that thought they had already made the comments necessary relative to the one they thought was being brought forward are kind of left in a vacuum. So, yeah, while there's an opportunity to comment on that earlier, the reality is that's not the project anybody thought was going forward at that time. I mean, isn't that true? Or have I got it wrong?
Well, the way CEQA works in an EIR is you have a project and you also have alternatives to the project.
Right.
That's always required in an EIR.
Right.
And well, I don't know how well the CEQA process is explained in the draft EIR, but that's a standard part of the CEQA process, that one of the alternatives might end up being the project that is actually approved. That's the purpose of having alternatives in the draft EIR.
No, I understand that.
In the interest of fairness, though, if you're going to consider a larger project, don't those folks that commented on the smaller project then have the opportunity to comment on a larger project?
They could have commented on it during the public review period of the draft EIR. It was in there.
Okay. All right. So, are you finished with your presentation?
Actually, no. I had just
continue. Continue.
but I'll skip over a lot of it based on what we've discussed so far.
Okay.
So, but I think it would probably be helpful for us to go through it in a more linear fashion, beginning to end, so you understand
Go right
what's
ahead.
in it and
Please
kind
do.
of where we are.
Is that a nice way of asking us to be quiet?
I like to talk to you, so I can appreciate questions and answer them. So the project considered is the project that is a smaller version of what you saw this evening, and it was for a 15-acre site, same site area, involved demolition of 26,000 square feet and building of 77,000 square feet of new retail restaurant space, and then 340 residential units. And then, so that was the project that was analyzed, and In addition, the alternatives were, and I will talk about those a little bit at the end of the presentation and talk through each of the ones that we considered. In the response to comments document, we've talked about what's in there a little bit, but there's copies of each of the comment letters received. There's written responses to each of the CEQA-related comments, and they're enumerated. And then there is, in that document, the consideration of the reduced Main Street alternative, a reduced version of the alternative that was analyzed at a level of detail similar to the proposed project in the draft EIR. And then there's a chapter that includes corrections and revisions to any of the text of the draft EIR that came out of the comments received, the responses, and any technical corrections. And that part of the document included very minimal changes and nothing that substantially changed the findings of the document. The topics that were addressed in the EIR include land use, population and housing. The topics shown in bold are the areas where we identified significant impacts and recommended mitigation measures. I'm not going to go through each one of those impacts and mitigation measures. They're detailed in there, and we want to end sometime this evening. Traffic, circulation, parking, air quality, noise and vibration, hazardous materials and public safety, geology, soil seismicity, hydrology and storm drainage, cultural and paleontological resources, aesthetic resources, public services and utilities, wind, shade, and shadow. As you can see, it was a very comprehensive document. It evaluated each of the topics required under CEQA. Many of the topic areas identified impacts that were less than significant, or that they would be reduced to a less than significant level with the mitigation measures recommended. For the project that was analyzed, which is not the reduced Main Street alternative, we identified 12 potentially significant unavoidable impacts related to transportation, 2 related to existing plus project conditions, and then 5 in the 2010 scenario and 5 in the 2030. Many of those significant unavoidable impacts related to that the city of Emeryville does not have jurisdiction over the intersections, and so we can't guarantee that that mitigation measure will be implemented. One of the intersections was in Berkeley. Several of them were under Caltrans jurisdiction. So in those instances, mitigation measures are recommended, but we just could not ensure that they would be implemented, and so as a result, they are identified as potentially significant unavoidable. Okay, now we get to the alternatives. So in the draft EIR, we considered a total of 4 alternatives: the no project alternative, the reduced footprint alternative, a tower alternative, and the Main Street alternative. Both the tower alternative and the Main Street alternative were recognized as being alternatives that were more intense than the proposed project, and that the city was considering those in this EIR based on a more project merit basis, and that that type of project, there had been some interest on either the developer or the public side to propose something similar, more intense than the proposed project. So that was explained in the alternative section as to why we were including those, because typically the purpose of the alternative section under CEQA is to look at alternatives that would lessen the impacts of the proposed project. But oftentimes now, particularly as you get into the mixed-use projects, the alternative section in CEQA documents the purpose of that is twofold. One, to look at what may be better referred to as variants of the proposed project, and then the second, to meet the objectives of CEQA, looking at alternatives that would lessen the impacts of the proposed project.
Now, would you say that's a function of the Planning Commission to take a look at an environmental document like that and then propose alternatives? Is that?
I'm sorry, I didn't.
Is that a function of the Planning Commission to take a look at a project like that and then to suggest alternatives? Is that appropriate in a planning process?
Yes. I mean, as far as the planning process goes, independent of the CEQA process, I mean, the alternatives that we considered in the draft EIR didn't so much come out of discussion with the Planning Commission. Now, the reduced Main Street alternative did come out of some discussion and comments received at the Planning Commission hearing from both the public and the Planning Commission. And yes, that's common. And I mean, again, the purpose of CEQA is to provide public input into the process and the project.
Okay.
Yeah, if you're asking specifically about the role of the Planning Commission here, as opposed to the City Council, I think...
Well, no, I'm just asking if it's appropriate for the Planning Commission to consider additional alternatives for a project that's being proposed based on input in the document.
And the City Council also.
Yeah,
Yeah,
okay,
I mean,
great.
technically, right now, the Planning Commission hasn't really, they've considered it for purposes of CEQA and this EIR, and they feel that the EIR provided an adequate analysis of that additional alternative.
Okay,
So
great.
that's as far as the Planning Commission has taken
Right.
it.
Okay.
So this these tables go through the difference of each alternative. I'm not going to walk through these unless anybody wants me to specifically.
Well, we did that at the earlier part of the meeting. So.
Yeah, I mean, this is each of the alternatives, the tower, the Main Street. And if anybody has specific comments on those questions, we can go
Can you
back
just go
to
back
those.
to the reduced Main Street for a second?
Sure. So here's the reduced Main Street. It shows the difference between the last two columns on the right show the difference between the reduced Main Street to the project, and then also shows the difference of the reduced Main Street to the Main Street alternative. So you can see the difference that compared to the reduced Main Street alternative that was analyzed in the draft EIR, there is 336 additional units, but approximately 11,000 less of retail, and then approximately 309,000 less of office. So that provides you the comparison, and then relative to the project, it's approximately 334 additional units, additional 180,000 square feet of retail restaurant, and then on the office, additional 105,000, and then the removal of the movie theater is the reduction of the 40,000 square feet there. And so again, the Main Street alternative was evaluated at a detailed level in the draft EIR. So this shows you that it is overall less development than that alternative. Comments on the draft EIR, we received a number of comments, but not a significant amount relative to a lot of other projects. This lists the different commenters. We were able to go through and provide responses to each of the letters, and did not feel that any of the responses necessitated any significant amendments to the draft EIR findings.
Can I ask a question here?
Sure.
I noticed in that document, a lot of the comments, the responses to the letters, where this speaks to the merits of the project and is thus therefore beyond the scope of an environmental impact response, and so no further comment is needed. And that was kind of the standard fallback to not addressing, quote, what they consider the merits of the project. So for the people who wrote in concerned about merits of the project, they didn't get their questions responded to, and where would that happen?
I'll take a first stab at that, but my guess is Charlie will want to. I'll address the CEQA side of it, and then I'll let Charlie address the planning side of it. It's very typical. People, when you're looking at a project of this size, even a smaller project, people have a really hard time separating the project merit issues from the CEQA issues. So we try to be as responsive as we can without blending the two together too much, and so if there's something we can provide as a simple clarification, we do, but if it gets into more the subjective merits of the project, then that is considered during the time the staff report is written and staff presents on the project.
That's right. We'll consider those comments, and the Planning Commission and City Council will consider those comments when you consider the actual approval of the preliminary development plan.
Thank you.
So that is an overview of the CEQA process and what has been done to date. The Planning Commission, as we mentioned, did recommend certification. Your recommendation, or your certification means the final EIR has been completed in compliance with CEQA, was reviewed and considered, I'm sorry, this should say City Council, and found to provide an adequate analysis of the project and alternatives described in the final EIR, and finally, that it reflects the lead agency's independent judgment and analysis. That's what your decision is tonight, is does that provide you adequate information to do that, to say that the document is adequate environmental analysis. Again, it's not to approve or disapprove any of the project or any of the alternatives that we've talked about.
Great.
So with that, I'm available for any additional questions.
Charlie, do you, any questions? No? Okay, Charlie?
Ask one.
All right. Anything else to say?
No?
Okay, well then, we'll open this up to public comment.
Yes, I just want to clarify, this is not a public hearing, but it's an administrative item, but the council certainly can take public comment on it if you wish to.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Anybody here wishing to comment on this item? No, we already heard most of what you wanted to say, but...
Eric Hallman, Madison Marquette, Managing Director, Developer, Bay Street. I won't reiterate what I said earlier, but again, I'm here about process. Projects seem to have a number of merits, but there's a number of things, and I'm no CEQA expert, which is why I'm asking you for no time. That doesn't cost the developer, does not slow the developer's project down. There's some unusual things that happened here in this EIR. First of all, the alternatives were of larger scope than the proposed project. Usually, the custom that I'm experienced with is that the alternatives are of lesser impact or at least equal impact as the proposed project. The second thing that was unusual is that through a public comment process, the project actually increased in size. And again, that's an unusual outcome of the public comment process as a project increases. This leads us interested third parties who are watching the process, again, not sitting here through your meetings on a regular basis, but obviously interested observers. It's confusing to us and to see this happen. What were described earlier as the alternatives being variants really were not variants. They were completely different projects with a completely different a mix of land use components. So all I'm asking is for time to meet with the applicant, not only review the plans with Denise, but I want to review my plans with Denise. And I want her to understand what we're doing, and I want to know how my project impacts hers. So I think this sort of synchronization of these major projects you want to have occur, and it's not occurring right now, in my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Jeff Sears, Wareham Development. I have to echo many things that Eric has said. One of the beauties of this city is it's small, and so often people are able to work together and have very open and constructive dialogues. For whatever reason, intentional or otherwise, we just don't feel quite that way about this project because for 2 years we've talked about the Big Four, and this project being brought in is different than that. The EIR process is one that's very important, and it asks for public comment. But what's been said tonight is there were 4 alternatives. We asked for public comment. We got it. We shut public comment and came up with a 5th new one. Now we, the consultant, without the public having any opportunity to opine, have decided it's not materially impactful. We're deciding that alone, without any input, and that's now the project that's being proposed. So the one that's being proposed is not one that's had public comment. It's certainly not one we considered. We didn't know we should. It was presented as a done deal, and I just don't feel good about that. And we would like also to have a limited amount of time to understand that. If that's the proposed project, we'd like to understand it with Denise, with the consultant. Maybe we'll be convinced If she believes there aren't impacts, maybe she can convince us. We'd be happy to be convinced, but we haven't had that dialogue that SEEK was supposed to allow. So we're just asking for a small amount of time also. We don't know if you'll grant this small amount of time, so we've actually had to create some additional comments to that reduced Main Street alternative because we haven't had the opportunity to comment before, and so we've got them here. They're things we'd rather dialogue about in an open environment. Much has been said that there's no binding action here in terms of you're not approving a project. For that very reason, there should be no purpose in having to act on it now. As long as you act on it parallel with the approval process, it doesn't slow the Martin Group, the TMG, down at all. So maybe this could be resolved faster, but I don't see any, important reason to act on it tonight, and we'd ask you to take more time, and I'm going to give some extra comments here.
Okay, thank you. Is there any other comments?
Yeah, Brian Donahue again. So as it appears here tonight, I've been listening with interest, appears what we have going on here regarding the certification is sort of a clash of the titans between Bay Street 2, of course the Market Street, and then the Transit Center. The gentleman from I believe from the Transit Center sort of, I think, summed it up when he said that there's scarce infrastructure, and basically, in essence, he wants his project to be able to take the lion's share of the infrastructure. So what it seems like we have here is developer greed, which is, I've seen a fair share of that in my life. So my take on this is a finite amount of public goodwill regarding vis-a-vis traffic, and these other two developers are nervous that if you certify this project, they're not going to be able to they want the lion's share of be able to take the traffic before the people get fed up with it, and I think that's what's going on here. So if you certify this tonight, that sort of starts the clock ticking for this project, and these other developers are nervous about that because they're greedy. They want to get their projects done, and they're nervous that this one might hinder theirs, and it's pretty obvious that's what's happening here. So what's really going on here tonight is I think you should just certify this project. To do otherwise is to engage in politics, and I don't think that's appropriate here. And so it's sort of like what we're looking at here is, of these three projects, who's got the moxie? Really, that's what we're really looking at here. I think these guys are disingenuous to claim that they didn't know that the alternatives could possibly be a final project. I think is sort of ridiculous. I mean, they're professionals. I think they knew that, and I think they're not being entirely truthful. And so this project, I think, is a rare example of a good quality development, the kind of development we want, and to not certify this, I think, would be to be playing politics.
Thank you. Any other comments?
Mayor?
Okay, yes.
Yeah, I'd like to, I guess I'm going to jump into the disingenuous thing, and I guess, Brian, you can evaluate this, that the three developers that we're talking about all contributed to my campaign, and two want a delay, and so I guess it's twice as much money for me, so that's why I'm going to say what I'm going to say. You can carry out that. Look, all big projects do study environmental impacts, and specifically traffic. We know that, and each of these four would individually have to do that and will have to do that. We did something unique here because of our concern of all the input that we've had about traffic relative to these projects. And we decided to join them together in a traffic study that we asked to have done. They're all still going to have to do their individual impacts just as this one is done, but we asked to have it done jointly this time because we wanted to see how these four projects were going to impact the big thing. They're all happening at about the same time. So it's a step in the direction of good planning. Let's look at the big picture instead of one at a time. So now we're looking at a situation where the project that they thought was coming forward is not the one that's coming forward. It's certainly going to have more impacts on traffic than the one that they thought was coming forward. And they're not here asking that this project or that this EIR be turned down. They're asking for a couple of weeks to meet with the folks from the Martin Group and to try to figure out if they in fact have concerns. And what I say to my colleagues, if this avoids, well, first of all, you can tell there's some bad feelings here because they feel like there's been a little bait and switch going on, and that's not how we want to do business. Second of all, why do we want to take a chance, and it may happen anyway, but why do we want to take a chance on a challenge to the EIR when they're saying, give us a couple weeks to sit down and figure out if we really have a problem? Maybe we don't. We're going to meet again in a couple weeks. This can be back on the agenda. The developer doesn't have any problem. We can try to, these are folks that we've worked with on lots of projects. We're going to be working on lots more. And besides these two projects, I think that the Gateway project people ought to be sitting at the table with this. And let's give them the chance to go do that and then come back in 2 weeks and see where we stand. To me, it seems like a no-brainer. What is the reason for having drawn these folks together in one sense over a huge issue and then just kind of throwing it to the wind? I don't get it. So I'm in favor of delaying until the next meeting, this item, so that they can have their chance to meet and see if they can figure out if in fact they have differences. Maybe they don't.
Okay, the only question that I ask here is that an environmental review is a statement of facts. I mean, it's a statement of facts. It took a look at a project that's 1.2 million square feet, and it evaluates the impacts of that project. So if we hold this over for 3 weeks or for a month, how is that going to change the statement of facts? All we're doing here is we're certifying a document that says we've looked at the analysis of this project and we feel that the analysis is correct. This analysis could be the very basis upon which they could go to the Planning Commission and say, well, gee, this does take away our capacity, because this EIR shows that it's going to take all the traffic, all the available traffic opportunities away, and so this document could be evidence that they would use to tell the Planning Commission, hey, this project's too big and it has to be scaled back. So, I mean, if I understand what we're doing here, we're certifying a document of facts and research information, and are those facts correct? So that's what we're doing here. I don't see how that impacts their ability to do anything except use this information and say, well, hey, the project may be too big, we don't have enough capacity, so let's see if we can change it and scale the project to a different size.
Well, Ken, that all makes sense, but you haven't answered my basic question, is what is the harm in a 2-week delay so that the concerns that are being raised can be addressed? Why do you want to just leave this angst sitting out there, because technically we can approve it tonight? Why do you want to do that? It doesn't make sense to me. These are folks we work with every day and that have got huge projects coming before us. And why don't we try to keep the team working together instead of being at odds with one another, if that's possible?
Okay, well, I will answer that, but there may be some other comments.
Nora wants to,
I find myself in a very peculiar position here. For the second time in an evening, I agree with Mr. Donahue. And I think we should move forward on certifying this EIR. This city, this staff, the Planning Commission has acted in good faith. We've been carrying on this process since 2005, and I believe, Councilmember Cassis, you may indeed be a little disingenuous, because it is very difficult for me to believe that the two gentlemen who stood up here in a 1 square mile city could not get together with the representatives of TMG in this 45-day period. I move approval of the certification of this EIR.
I'll second that.
Don?
I have no comment.
Okay, well, all right, then call the roll.
Councilmember Davis.
Aye.
Councilmember Fricke.
Aye.
Councilmember Cassis.
No.
Vice Mayor Atkin.
Aye.
Mayor Bukowski.
It's already decided. Aye. Okay. All right.
Thank you, Brian.